Hello and welcome everyone to the September session of Tech Host Academy Sandbox session with our special guest, Amanda Fenton. And we're going to be focusing on Zoom webinars. Now, this session will be recorded and I will spotlight Amanda and I, but just so that you know, even though two people are spotlighted, if you speak, you're going to show up in the recording. And we'll just make this available to those who purchase it, and it will live in the archives at Tech Host Academy, just so that you know. So thank you all for having on your camera. If you wish not to be seen, you're welcome to turn that off. And I'm very excited to see all of you. And let's go ahead and get started because I know you're excited to be here. A couple of things that I just want to talk about before I introduce Amanda is that webinars are so very different. And so we all know that Zoom is always changing. The functionality for host and co-host are different in the webinar platform, in the webinar, I should say, atmosphere or environment. There are specific webinar settings. So if you're thinking, oh, it's the same as meetings, nope, there's a whole new slew of settings that you get when you purchase the webinar add-on. And right now, I think there's also a special that they're running that you can have a free 45-minute session for webinar to try it out. And if you're new to Zoom webinars, I like to recommend to take some meaningful time to learn how to behave in them. Now, I'll tell you that I had a session about a month ago. We did lettering for pencils, and it was a class that I was teaching, and Amanda was the tech host. So part tech host, part angel. Amanda recently tech hosted for me in the webinar format. She's an expert in participatory meeting design and facilitation for online and hybrid sessions. She's one of my go-tos. So she regularly attends our sandbox sessions and has become a great thought partner for Zoom webinars. You can learn more about Amanda at amandafenton.com, and I'll be sure to place that link in the chat. And so I'd love to ask, Amanda, where are you dialing in from today?
Today, I am in our little apartment in very close to Vancouver, Canada, on the nation lands of the Kakite territory and other Coast Salish nations. And it's 9 o'clock in the morning here, a smidge after.
Wonderful. And we have folks dialing in actually from all over the world, which is really exciting. And I wanted to ask you, do you call yourself a tech host, a producer, moderator, or how would you identify yourself?
Many of those terms, I usually describe myself as a participatory meeting designer, facilitator, tech host for online and hybrid sessions.
Awesome.
My expertise lends to the design process as well as actually supporting all the technology and online collaboration tools.
I love that. And I just asked the question about tech host or producer or moderator because I still hear a lot of different terms thrown around in the field. And so just want to let folks know that there's lots of ways to describe ourselves. And it sounds to me like tech hosting is just one small portion of what you do, like many of us. Yeah. Great. So before I turn it over to you, and I know I'll still be here to help, guide that conversation, I'm curious, what is your favorite part of your role as specifically a tech host? And how did you come into becoming a tech host?
My favorite part of the role is because I do have so much of my background is in facilitation and particularly participatory group processes, is helping imagine how can we do these brilliant things that we can do in person. How can we do them on Zoom? Like, what are the ways that we can adapt the technology for these meaningful conversation spaces, and then also bring in all of these very cool online collaboration tools to help us do, some of what we do in the room with paper and pen and sticky notes and all of that, but being able to imagine how can we do it online. I love that part of my role. And what was your other question?
The other question is, how did you come to this? It sounds like out of many of us, it came out of need, right?
Yeah, well, a part of it, and Linda will know this because we worked for the same organization many years ago, and part of my role at the time was bringing e-learning into the organization. So many years ago, e-learning was a new thing, And so I was part of the team that was bringing in some of the first e-learning tools, learning platforms. And so back then I was in this space of learning, online tools, et cetera. So it goes way back. And then I've just always been kind of a geek when it comes to tools like this. So it was just been a natural part of always having some online aspect of the work that I do.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to get to some questions in just a bit, but first I want to ask Amanda to talk a little bit to us with us about Zoom webinars and how they're different, and share some of your insights.
Would love to. Before I speak, though, I would love to ask everyone that's with us let me pop this in the chat. Have you hosted or tech hosted a Zoom webinar before? Just getting a sense of who else out here. You can either let us know in the chat or give us an emoji, a thumbs up emoji on the screen. I'm mostly seeing heads nodding no. So no one else familiar with hosting or tech hosting a Zoom webinar. Cool. Okay. Welcome to the mystery and magic of Zoom webinars. So back to your question, Heather, they are two totally different products, which is a little bit confusing because they sort of look the same. And I think the other confusing aspect of it, I made two fun little signs for us today, Zoom webinars, Zoom meetings, is a lot of people describe a webinar, but they're actually hosting it in a meeting. And so you'll see people say like, join this webinar, but it's actually a Zoom meeting. Whereas Zoom webinar is actually a totally separate product or platform that Zoom offers. And as Heather was saying earlier, you can't assume that it's the same as Zoom meetings. It does have different functionality. Even the language is different. And when I first, it was one of my clients last year where they said, we think we want to do this as a webinar. And I was like, ooh, this is going to be my first webinar. And it was a whole translation journey as someone who feel like I know Zoom meetings pretty well, like to understand what is this world of Zoom meetings. So let me give you just kind of like some high level description of the two, and then we'll get into some of the nuances. So Zoom meetings, the platform that we're in right now, they're intended or designed to be, more collaborative, where all participants can screen share. If that functionality is turned on, they can turn on their audio, their videos. They can see who else is in attendance, not just on the screen, but also the participants list. And it has more interactivity in terms of breakout rooms. There's a little asterisk with that, but just hold that in our mind at the moment. Whereas webinars, Zoom webinars, are more like a virtual like lecture hall or auditorium. They're ideal for larger audiences, events that are more open to the public. The Zoom webinar licenses start at a capacity of 500 participants. So right out of the gates, they have the capacity to host way more people because they don't have all that audio video, basically. It's like more the main way that participants are participating is in listen only mode, listen and view only mode. So Zoom webinar participants don't join with their cameras, and everyone does not have their audio. They're muted. So I think of it, sort of your typical webinar usually has, one or a few people that will be speaking to an audience in more of like the one-to-many format. There's still interaction in webinars. You can use the chat, Q&A, polling questions, but it's more limited and it's more anonymous because participants don't know who else is there. They just will see the presenters, or what Zoom calls panelists. My little asterisk that I mentioned earlier is around breakout rooms. So previously, there was like a very clear difference when it came to breakout rooms, that Zoom meetings had breakout rooms, webinars did not. That is no longer the case. Zoom is now introducing breakout rooms with webinars, and it's not something I have played around with or yet, so I don't really know the functionality of it, But that is important to know that that's no longer the case, that only Zoom meetings has breakout rooms. I'm going to pause there before we get into some of the differences. Heather, anything you wanted to add in terms of that kind of high level difference between webinars and Zoom meetings?
I did want to say that I mentioned earlier that co-hosts and hosts have different functionalities. We've learned that in meetings, but it's also true in webinars. And all of the settings, again, look completely different. And so, what I wanted to mention is you were saying that you can chat or not, or you can chat in webinars. You certainly can, but you can also set the chat feature to be either chat, Q&A just to the panelists. Once the panelists are inside, there's a whole nother setting for them as well. So if we were in a Zoom webinar right now and it was just Amanda and I, we could have a whole background of panelists that you're not even seeing that are in the room that we can pull in. So it's high production. So really that's really the main difference. And as a tech host, I would say that it feels different because, again, you're not having to mute anyone. You're not worried with as many types of Zoom bombers and in the different ways that they could come in and do things. But you do have to be more of in a production mindset, and it's much quieter. Yeah. So if you're used to presenting and wanting it to be more interactive, it's definitely more one way. So just kind of recapping what you just said.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I want to just pick up on something you said, Heather. I think that from a tech host perspective, you are doing way less participant managing, as you were saying, like you're not monitoring who's accidentally unmuted themselves, or maybe someone on camera who's not doing appropriate things while an elder is doing their opening and you need to stop their video. Which, to your point too, that it reduces some of the chance of Zoom bombing, but it doesn't eliminate it completely. So I think that's too a little bit of a myth that a Zoom webinar is completely safe from Zoom bombers. That's not the case. I think it reduces some of the likelihood, but it's not completely safe from Zoom bombers. I used to think that, like, oh, Zoom webinar is totally safe, but someone, I don't know, while they're in another part of Canada, they ran a session recently that was an actual Zoom webinar and they did get Zoom bombed. And I was like, wow, okay, this is still possible even in Zoom webinars. Yeah. I'm going to pop another question in the chat. We're going to get into some of the other, what I call like my translation journey as a tech host, from like meeting language to webinar functionality. But I also want to just pause and gather up, are there any sort of questions that are coming to your mind, curiosities about Zoom webinars that we can just make sure that we pick up as we go? So just inviting space for your questions in the Zoom chat. And I'm just going to scroll down through some of my notes here to talk about some of the other just key differences that are helpful to know about from a tech hosting perspective. I'm gonna just keep going, Heather. So just interrupt me. Oh, here we go. Can you use Zoom webinar to host a conference session with several breakout sessions? Yes, is the short answer, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you could use both Zoom webinar and Zoom meetings. You could have your main sessions happening in a Zoom webinar. This just happened at a conference I was at recently. And then they had breakout rooms that were all hosted in Zoom meetings. So different links, with Zoom meetings that were likely done in multiple different Zoom accounts. And Heather, have you seen that as well, that combination of webinar plus meetings?
Yes, and we were talking about this right before we came on. I was a part of a planning session. I didn't get to go to the actual event, but I got reported back. There was a Zoom webinar that had close to 300 participants working in 4 different languages. And so when we went to go to the breakout sessions, we had to use the Zoom meetings in order to put them in there so that they could be in channels so that they could know what language they were in. So it was very, very challenging. But I'm curious about, and tell me if I'm saying this correctly, is it Jacoben? Okay. I'm wondering, she's saying, can you use Zoom webinar to host a conference with several breakout sessions? Can you still do the breakout sessions in webinar without having to go to meetings?
That I would say possibly. That's in that new realm of breakout room functionality that Zoom is introducing with Zoom webinars that I haven't played around with personally yet.
Yeah. So always go back and super test this. Lots of tech checks would be
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Like I'll say a little bit why I'm curious about it, because Zoom webinar, it's based on people not being able to, not everyone turning on their video or their audio. And so I'm really curious about, in Zoom webinar breakout rooms, like, do they suddenly enable that for everyone, especially with such large audiences? So yeah, I have a lot of curiosities about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Karen's asking, I've only attended one webinar and there seem to be two types of tech hosts. Sending a message via chat didn't yield an answer. Oh, this is a really interesting learning about the Zoom chat. I'm not going to answer that question yet because there's some language differences in Zoom webinar that is helpful to learn first before I answer that. So maybe let me jump in.
You're so
One
good. You're so good. I would have gotten sidetracked and answered and said, oh, wait, I got to go back.
we
Good.
gotta get some shared terminology first. But one of the big differences between Zoom webinar and Zoom meeting is Zoom meetings. Generally, we have our waiting room enabled. So you like start your meeting, your client maybe arrives, some of your presenters arrive early, you've got your waiting room going, and you're just letting in those early arrivals. Like today, Heather let me in early and we chatted a little bit. Zoom webinar, no waiting room. That does not exist. In the Zoom webinar realm, they have something called a practice session. And you turn that on, you enable that when you are setting up the webinar. It's not functionality like the waiting room that you can just turn on and turn off once you've started your meeting. It's like when you set up your webinar, you have to say, yes, enable practice session. And that practice session, you start kind of when you start your webinar, you're starting the practice session. It's not a waiting room. So you don't know how many other people are waiting for the webinar to start. You have no clue. It's a total mystery. So the practice session, I wouldn't say it replaces the waiting room because it has different functionality, but it's really helpful to know that there is no waiting room. But then you might be asking, like, that's great, but then how do you let people in early? Like, how do you let your main speakers in early, your other guest presenters? And the way that you do that is Zoom webinar, they call like presenters panelists. So important language, panelists is the language that Zoom webinar uses. So you will have your Zoom host, the person who kind of like has the functionality to actually start the webinar, start that practice session, and then you can designate people as panelists. And panelists that have been set up ahead of time in the Zoom account can join the practice session before all the participants arrive. And how Zoom enables that to happen is each panelist gets their very own unique link that enables them to join the webinar before you actually go live, like while you're in that practice session. That is huge. Like from a tech host perspective, it's, when I think about my Zoom meetings, it's just so I just can share the same link with everyone, and all of our, facilitation team, they know to arrive early. You just let them in, from the waiting room, you hold everyone else separately. With Zoom webinars, when the people that you need to arrive early, you have to preset them up ahead of time with their names and their email addresses, so they all get their own individual link to be able to join that practice session ahead of time. And I created like a whole separate customized email that I send to panelists so they understand, like, oh, you can't click anyone else's link. You have to click your link to be able to join early. So that language of panelist is really important. Panelists, when they join, they can have their video on and their audio on. So they're granted that additional functionality, whereas everyone else joining the webinar just shows up, to be able to participate in the chat.
I have a quick
Yeah.
caveat
Yeah.
because you were able to bring people who are participants into the panelists once the meeting starts.
Exactly.
And then there's a
Yes.
whole nother set of functionality for them. Because I remember, Mary, you were brought in. I think you were brought into the lettering with pencils, but then there was some. They actually had limitations. I found out later that they couldn't use the chat, or something like, or maybe you could use the chat, but you couldn't turn on your camera or something like that. So there's a whole nother set of um, of those settings that we have to keep in mind. So again, that production mindset.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And to what Heather was saying earlier, so you can upgrade any participant, like once you've gone live with the webinar, you can upgrade a participant to panelist, which then gives them, video and audio functionality. I have this information guide I'll share with everyone. So just scrolling up here, you give everyone their own unique link. And they actually, when they click that link, they even, Zoom tells them like, oh, you're joining this webinar as a panelist. So it even gives them that prompt when they click the link, they would say, okay. If you're promoting someone to a panelist during the actual webinar, that person also gets a notification message that they will be promoted. And I think the language is so different from Zoom meetings that I think it can trip people up. So that preparation work ahead of time with folks is really helpful for people that aren't as used to the Zoom webinar realm. So we've talked about this panelist language, which is really important. We've talked about there's no waiting room, but there is a practice session. Also, Zoom webinars right now don't have the lovely customized message that you can customize in your account when people are joining a Zoom meeting. It's a lot more basic right now. So you can just see it's kind of like the old style of Zoom where it just says, please wait, the webinar will start soon. So right now there's no custom graphic or custom message that you can create for the Zoom webinar, kind of that waiting page. It's just very basic right now. I hope they'll change that because it's been so lovely with Zoom meetings to be able to have more of a customized waiting page. So fingers crossed that will improve. Okay, so let's imagine we're in our practice session and we've got our panelists with us. We're waiting. It's almost go time. And you're thinking, well, if you don't have a waiting room, how do you start? What do you do to begin? And with Zoom webinars, there is this message at the top of your Zoom window. It says you are in a practice session. And then there's this blue button that says start webinar. And only the Zoom host and anyone who has been designated as a Zoom co-host can see that start webinar, not all of the panelists, which I was very relieved about because I was very nervous. I had one session where we had 14 panelists. I was so worried that one of them was going to click that start webinar button before we were ready to begin because it's so inviting. You just want to click it at the top of your window, but only the Zoom host and any Zoom co-host can see that. And so once you're ready for go time, it's 3 minutes to 9 or whatever it is, you would click that start webinar. And one of the things that I noticed is it seems to take a little longer for everyone to come in to the webinar. Once you click start webinar, it's not instantaneous. It's to me, it's not even as fast as Zoom meetings. There's a little bit more of a delay for everyone to arrive. Yeah, Heather, you're saying.
Yeah, I was just going to add that this is a great time to put up a timer with some music so that people know where they are. Make sure that you type something in the chat to welcome them because it's one of those things where you really want to make sure that everybody's in before you start. Otherwise, they feel a little, ooh. And by putting up a welcome screen saying where they are, that'll help them know that they're in the right place.
Yeah, exactly. Zoom also has this lovely double check. Once you click start webinar, it brings up a second message. At the moment, it says, let's get this started. Once you click start, attendees can join this webinar. And then you have to click start again. So it does have a little bit of a second, are you really ready to go live before you click that? If for some reason you like accidentally started that before you were really ready, the Zoom host could like end the webinar for all, go back in and restart it in the practice session. So there is a little bit of like, if you had to redo it, you could. You would never need to do that though. I'm going to just check in the chat. Anything else rocking in the chat so far, Heather?
I
Oh, you
don't see
caught Linda's
anything.
question. What's the max number of Zoom meeting? Oh, good. You caught that question. Great.
Yeah. Feel free to add
Um,
more if you have more questions as you go through the document. That might also, things may also come up.
yeah. The other thing that I did a lot of testing on just to really make sure I understood the difference in Zoom webinar is who can see whose videos. Um, and so, as I was saying earlier, Zoom panelists can turn their videos off and on. They have their own functionality to do that. The Zoom co-host or host doesn't have to do that for them. They can do that. And they will be able to see all of the other panelists' videos, which is really lovely. Particularly, I think, Heather, you and I had this experience because everyone else is in listen only mode. You can really feel like you're just speaking into the abyss. So if you do have other panelists, they're kind of like your little stage, if you will, like your audience that you can actually see. But so here's an example. This is me doing some testing. This is me as a panelist, and I can see, I was just a second me, but I could see all of the other panelists' videos. But I'm just going to scroll down a little bit more. The participants could only see the video that the Zoom tech host chooses. So in this case, I was just spotlighting someone. So you can see here, they can only see the video that the Zoom tech host was choosing, where as panelists, they can all see each other, a little bit more like how it looks like in Zoom meetings. So really important to know, I like to join a webinar with my backup device as a participant. So I'm just always monitoring like what really are the Zoom participants seeing, in case I've like messed up in my spotlighting or something like that. But it's a little bit different than in Zoom meetings, because Zoom meetings, you can spotlight someone and everyone else can still see, all the other cameras along the top, or if they go back to gallery view. Zoom webinar, different. You
Right.
have much more control about what's being seen.
Absolutely. You, as a participant here, you can pin anybody. You can decide what your viewing experience is like. You can go to the view and change the gallery view, speaker view, all of that. But in Zoom webinars, you can't. I also wanted to remind folks that in some cases, and this kind of goes back maybe a little bit to what Karen was asking, when you are a tech host for Zoom webinars, you may be like Amanda and I and trying to figure it out, right? We were working together. Of course, she's a pro, but we still spent a few hours together prepping because she's asking me, how do you want the participant experience to be like? And so all of those settings needed to align for that. Whereas you might also be in a situation where you're working with an AV person who maybe works for an organization and they have all of the settings already set up. And your role might be just making sure that people are spotlit, or you are just dedicated to the chat. So there's lots of different roles that you might be playing depending on where you are in relationship to the Zoom webinar. Are you setting it up or someone else setting it up? And that's important to know. Something also important to remember, and Amanda was talking about, she feels really confident in putting, having a couple of extra devices. What were you using, like a laptop or an iPad?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
laptop.
Exactly.
My main computer is an iMac, and then I have a laptop that I use as a second participant device.
And that's great. You could also use a tablet or a phone, but you know that you have much limited, capabilities with those. But it's pretty much just to see what are the participants seeing. Remember, there's a couple of things you want to keep in mind, though. Your own bandwidth. You don't want
Mhm.
to add a whole bunch of different devices if you don't have the bandwidth. So if you're operating less than 50 megabytes, and I wouldn't even go that low, don't do that second device. Also, keep in mind that you've got to not connect to audio. Maybe you connect so you can listen. Can they hear everything? And then either disconnect it or definitely volume down, mute everything. Yeah.
Mhm.
So sorry, I just wanted to dig it
Yeah.
down into the tech host Yeah, the tech host point of view.
No, that's super. And actually, it's a really lovely just jumping off point to chat about who can speak, because that's another difference in Zoom meetings where we are today. Well, I feel like there's so many caveats to all of this because we also have a lot of functionality choices inside Zoom meetings. So, like as an example, we could not allow participants to unmute themselves in a Zoom meeting. So you would all be stuck on mute, even if you wanted to speak. Whereas in Zoom webinars, that's the way it is. Everyone is muted. People do not have the ability to unmute themselves, but you can still allow someone at an individual level to be able to speak. And I've seen this lots on webinars where someone has a question maybe, and the panelists do say, oh, hey, could you say a little bit more about your question? And then as the Zoom tech host, you actually go into that participant list and you grant permission to that individual participant to unmute themselves. So there's sort of like an extra step that you can do to allow a participant to be able to speak. And then you can also, withdraw that permission. So you can just temporarily enable it for someone and then withdraw that permission afterwards. But it's not the same as Zoom meetings where just anyone can unmute themselves. But it's lovely to know that at least that is possible. It's not that you don't have to upgrade someone to be a panelist for them to speak. You can just give them permission to be able to unmute themselves and speak. Yeah, I just maybe want to jump down to talking about reactions and chat, because I've just, again, the learning curve of don't assume that Zoom webinars are the same as Zoom meetings. So Zoom chat, you need to, for the webinar, you need to make sure that the webinar chat settings in your Zoom account, after you've put on the webinar package, that the chat is enabled. So what happens is if you don't have the webinar package enabled, if you go into your Zoom settings, you won't even see webinar options. They won't even be visible to you. But once you put the webinar package on your Zoom account, then you will suddenly see all of these webinar settings, things like chat, reactions, polls, surveys. And how you have your settings in Zoom meetings does not automatically translate to Zoom webinar. So we discovered, Heather, didn't we, that Zoom chat was disabled for participants to be able to chat with everyone. It was like, oh, this is not working. Why are people we didn't even have the ability to change that inside the webinar test we were doing. Heather needed to go into your actual Zoom account settings, webinar, and turn on the chat functionality. We also discovered that with reactions, you had to turn on that functionality in your webinar settings. So all of these really little tiny things that we're just used to being set up the way we like them in our Zoom meetings don't automatically come across to Zoom chat. The other thing that I learned that I really wish Zoom would change, and I'm going to bring up just the chat setting options here so you can see. So this is after we had enabled the Zoom webinar chat in the Zoom account settings. Once we were in the Zoom webinar, you have that additional functionality where you can decide, that who panelists can chat with, if they can either just chat with host and panelists, or if they can chat to everyone, and attendees, if they can chat with no one, with hosts and panelists only, or with everyone. So that ability to change that inside the webinar once it's happening is still there. It looks a little bit different. And the thing that I would really love for Zoom to change is if you send a chat to host and panelist, it goes to all of them. You can't just choose I want to send a chat to this panelist, or I want to send a chat to this host. It goes to all of them. And then it's sort of up to someone to respond, which again, kind of from that producing mindset, you don't know if someone else has necessarily responded. It gets a little confusing, or yeah. So just to know that, oh, when someone messages to hosts and panelists, it goes to all of them. So it's helpful to ahead of time say, like, hey, who's going to be the primary person responsible for responding to those? I think I saw someone, Karen, when you said, hey, I attended, I remember sending a message and didn't get an answer. And it's possible that everyone was thinking, like, is someone else answering that? Who's answering that? Um,
And if it was just going to the chat and not to the Q&A. So we've got a chat window and we have a Q&A window. And
mhm,
depending on how you want to set this up, you can make one of those go away so that they're only focused on one. I know when I first went to Zoom webinars, I was like, well, do I put my question in the chat? Do I put it in the Q&A? Who gets it? And that's probably where the confusion is. Chat is oftentimes just, here's all the chatter. And then the Q&A is, here's the actual questions. Now, when we're in a meeting, we can say, can you put 3 question marks in front of your question so we know what's a question as opposed to what's just chatter. And I say chatter, but it's really just chat.
mhm.
Yeah.
Other thing we learned, and again, hopefully this changes soon, Zoom meetings. We have our very cool, like, new chat experience where we can have emojis, you can have threaded replies. The file sharing is way cooler. You can share screenshots. Currently in Zoom webinar, it's like old school Zoom chat. So no threaded replies, no emojis, can't share a screenshot as easily. You can share files, but they can, like, be opened and then you show in Finder to see, like, where did they go. So just good to know. Currently Zoom webinar, it's old school chat functionality, not the new enhanced chat functionality, which I didn't realize how much I had grown to love until it was gone. um, we've touched on this a little tiny bit about reactions, but just to say a little bit more. So again, as Heather's just so wonderful at reiterating, double check all your settings. Reactions is another functionality that you have to make sure you have turned on in your webinar settings in your Zoom account. So that's the, like, lovely reactions button that folks can have. You can turn that on for the webinar once you have that functionality turned on. I have found on webinars, because people aren't able to see everyone, it does have a little bit of more limited functionality, that encouraging the use of reactions is a really lovely way to invite people into engaging in the webinar. Reactions do not show up in the recording, or I shouldn't say but, they show up differently though on the screen, which is kind of cool. And so how they show, I wish I had a better visual. This is like a really, really zoomed in screenshot, but they kind of float up the main video. And so, like, if we were in a Zoom webinar right now, and if everyone was doing a reaction, they would float up, the spotlighted video. All of them would float up. So they don't live kind of in the individual video boxes, because those don't exist. They kind of float up in an animated way on the screen. I found that it's like better visibility for your, like, panelists, because it's like right on the screen for them to be able to see those reactions. It's kind of cool. Heather, I'm trying to think, during our webinar, I think our folks were so busy lettering that they were not reacting as much.
Right. And so that's just it, is it depends on how you are designing the session to be presented. And so when we refer back to the session we were doing, it was lettering with pencils. It's very much one way presentation. People are heads down. And especially this particular deliverable with pencils, you've got to go really slow. It's a very quiet type of class. And so, yeah, people were heads down. We know that in a teaching atmosphere. But if you are presenting and you want to keep people engaging, remember, for those of you who have been in Tech Host Academy, where we went into the mural and brainstormed ways to keep meetings more engaging, efficient, and equitable, you want to, every couple of minutes, 8 minutes or so, depending on how how long your session is, keep people engaged, having them use the chat, having them to use different, maybe even third-party collaboration tools to keep them going and engaged. But yeah, I would say that in some instances, it's pretty much just pushing information. Yeah.
And if the reactions is something that you want to invite your folks into, what I have done in the past is that kind of opening housekeeping slide that you have displayed, like once you've pressed go live and folks are arriving. I have just some screen example instructions of, using the reactions and inviting people to try it out. So like while we're waiting, people are clicking that reactions button to try it out, kind of get them ready to go for using that functionality as we go. I'm going to jump gears a little tiny bit. One of the other differences in Zoom webinar is who can see the list of participants. So Zoom meeting, what we're in today, everyone can see the participants list. It's like, oh, everyone can see everyone's names, who's here. We can see how many people are here. There's 8 of us here in this Zoom meeting right now. With Zoom webinars, only the panelists, Zoom host, and co-hosts can see the list of attendees. So participants or attendees in webinar language can't see the list of who's all there. Only panelists, co-hosts, and Zoom hosts can see the actual attendees. And it looks a little bit different. Oh, sorry, Heather, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there is a setting where you can show how many attendees are there. So
Yes.
that's sort of a psychological thing, right? So if you know that you're putting together this webinar and you're like, ah, shucks, only 10 people showed up. Don't show how many people are in the room, and people might assume that there are thousands, right? And yet at the same time, if there's thousands, you might want to show to be like, whoa, this is a big event. This is a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, my sister works in marketing and she runs webinars all the time. I'm like, hey, do you usually show that? She's like, oh no. She's like, I don't want people to know that there's only 5 other people here. It's a
Right.
mystery.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So you can show what Heather's saying. You can show the number of participants, but that will only be the number. People will not see the name. So it is a little bit more anonymous, if you will. Of course, the chat currently isn't anonymous. For the Zoom co-hosts, hosts, and panelists, when they click that participants tab, the same way that we have in Zoom meetings, they actually will have 2 lists of people. So they'll have the panelist list that they can click on, and they'll see all the panelists listed. And then they can click on the attendees list, which is this next screenshot over here, and then they'll see the attendees listed. So it's a little bit of different functionality for panelists, Zoom hosts, and Zoom co-hosts to see who the participants are. Again, a little bit of sort of all these just nuanced differences of inside Zoom webinars. And I think the last thing I want to just flag as sort of a top level change or a difference translation is polls and surveys. So we've already mentioned, so Zoom webinars have Q&A that you can enable. They have polls, fairly similar to Zoom meetings. I haven't done enough with webinar polls to know how different they are from Zoom polls, but I would just say, assume there are differences. Don't assume that it's the same. But Zoom webinar also has survey. And the survey is something you can set up to be a post-webinar survey that happens with people. So it's different than a poll. It's called a survey that you can use. So you can think of Zoom webinars as having Q&A, polls, and surveys are 3 kind of functionality options that you can also choose from. Heather, have you encountered much around the surveys, the webinar surveys?
I haven't. But one of the things I kind of lit up when you said that, because I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is another one of those language differences that we may not be thinking about, right? And so just really quick, I wanted to throw this in the chat. I'd hope that this isn't a bit of a digression, but what this is the steps of learning. And what I love about working with Amanda is that she's telling us some things that we may not really be thinking about just yet, or it seems like it's conceptual until we actually get in there. But we don't know what kind of questions we're going to have until we're in it. And so remember, the 4 steps of learning is we don't know what we don't know. And so right now we're in that phase of, well, we don't know what we don't know, but you're getting some tidbits. Hopefully you've heard some things that you can put to use right away. But if you've never done this before and you don't plan on doing one, think about this as being a resource for you. So I'm curious, are there any aha moments that you've heard that you're thinking, oh, note to self, I need to remember that? Or do you have any questions that are coming up for you?
I'm waiting for the question of like, how do you decide if it's a Zoom webinar or a Zoom meeting? Is anyone wondering that? How do you decide? And you might have a client asking you, like, what should we do? Should we do it as a webinar? Should we do it as a meeting? And I'll be super honest. I feel like I don't even have like a perfect, crisp answer because, to me, the Zoom meeting and Zoom webinars, they're kind of like a Venn diagram. Like they do overlap. You do have so many control options inside a Zoom meeting. You can make them more webinar-like if you need to. But for me, some of like the top considerations are, what's the size of your group? If you're talking about 500, 600, 10,000 people, likely a webinar is going to be the direction that you go in. Of course, not necessarily, because Zoom meeting, can scale up really beautifully. But that might be one of my indicators, is like, how large are we talking about? How interactive do you need it to be? My other factor is, how public is this? If you are advertising widely on public, a Zoom webinar, again, might be more a way to lean, again, because of the just additional privacy consideration. You don't have your participants list isn't available to everyone. Your risk of Zoom bombing a little bit lower than Zoom meetings. One of the webinars that I did do was an awards event, and they didn't want to have any kind of registration process. They wanted to just be able to share the Zoom link out with their whole network, which was across Canada. And to me, that was like, ooh, also learning about the functionality that we didn't need to have. I was like, I would be more comfortable if this is a webinar, because you're sharing the Zoom link out with everyone. And the risk of that getting into, unfriendly hands is higher. And they didn't really need to see everyone. We weren't doing breakout rooms. It really was a one-to-many format with all of the presenters and the awards recipients and the chat active. So I was like, I think a webinar, and it was fairly small. It was like 60 or 70 people. So the size was small, but the spread of that Zoom link was going far and wide. So to me, I was like, I think a webinar is a little bit better here. Yeah. How about you, Heather? Any insights into when a webinar, when Zoom meeting, if you had to coach a client on deciding?
So you said size of group, interaction level, how public. And I'm going to say, you as a tech host, when I say stay in your lane, I'm really saying, what do you feel most comfortable supporting? So I had I had a student from Tech Host Academy the other day say, I have to do a Zoom webinar. What do I need to know? And I went, whoa, you need to meet Amanda. I said, have you ever done it before? She's like, nope. And I said, is it their first time doing a Zoom webinar? She said, yes. And I said, and when is it? And she said, in 3 days. And I said, turn it down. I said, don't do it. I said, unless you feel comfortable doing this, don't do it. And then, of course, I sent her, and I don't know if she reached out to you, Amanda, but I sent her to Amanda and Muddy because I know that in 3 days, if you've never done this, unless that's all you're going to do in those 3 days is to prepare for that and make sure that all the communications are correct. If they've never done it, you've never done it, you've got quite a learning curve there. So really, it's going to be about helping them determine if they need a Zoom webinar or a meeting, and if you are the person to support it. Right. So be honest with yourself. Are you the best athlete, and can you give that to someone else? And not so much because, it's not about your own self-confidence. It's more about the one of the premises of being a tech host is being of service, right? And can I really do what's right for this particular client? Yeah.
Mm, that's lovely. Lovely considerations.
Anyone else have anything to add? What would you, are things coming up for you? Like, do you have a client that's asking you to do a Zoom webinar, and what kind of questions are kind of bubbling up for you or from them?
While folks are noodling, again, I would go back to even the terminology, I think trips people up right out of the gates, because most people, when they say, I want to do a webinar, what they are likely meaning is, I want to do a video presentation to lots of people. They're not thinking about the difference between Zoom meeting platform and Zoom webinar platform. So I think part of our job, even if we feel like this is not our lane, is to ask them a little bit about what's the size of the group and what kind of functionality are you looking for? What anonymity considerations are important for participants. And then you can say, oh, it sounds like actually you do want to do a Zoom meeting, but you'll have a lot of presentation time. Or like, oh yeah, the platform of Zoom webinar is actually the right fit for you. And here's what you need to know.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I love these questions that
Mhm.
are coming in. And Jacobin, I would love to talk about your answer maybe as we get closer to more Q&A, and we might be going right into this unless Amanda has more to share, because I think the answer to your question is it depends on the circumstance and how you're designing the meeting, and also who's in the meeting. And we'll talk about that in just a second. With Linda's, she's asking, what blind spots do I need to consider? And that's what my client was, or my student was saying, is like, what do I need to know? It's like, oh, yeah, what are some of the gotchas, do you think, Amanda?
Hmm. Oh, here's one I'll say from my experience is your preparation time with your panelists is going to be more intensive than with regular presenters on a Zoom meeting, because of that language difference of being a panelist, because of them having their own Zoom, unique Zoom link. I think where we're at today is so many people are just like, oh, I just click a link and I go. And there's just a little bit more on the front end with panelists to really ready them for some of the differences. In, like, for me on this awards event, we really wanted all of the panelists to keep their videos on, especially for these awards recipients, because here they are, they're receiving these awards. It's in Zoom webinar, so they can't see all of their friends and family and, colleagues. And so we wanted them to feel like, to see people who were enthusiastic and excited for them to receive these awards. So we just really had to prepare them to say, no one else is going to be able to see your camera, until I spotlight you for your particular moment in time. But we would really love to have, all of the other panelists to be able to see you. So just there's more legwork, if you will, labor in preparing panelists for like those differences in the webinar format.
I have a bit of an
Yeah.
analogy for that. Imagine yourself as a stagehand, right? And you have invited people to come into the green room. And if you don't have the right email address for them, you know how some people have different email addresses and they can only get one email from their phone and the other email from their computer, and they're going to be at their computer and then it's on their phone and they're like, wait, how do I, it's about prepping them, making sure they're in the right green room, and then telling them when to go on stage. And you are about to go on stage now. So flow charts can be really, your flow documents or however you're managing your meetings are going to be really, really key in that aspect. And so I think it's about, again, the design. How complicated is this? Is this particular webinar, and how much do you need to move presenters on and off screen, spotlighting? And that means that you need to be really knowing what's about to happen. There's none of this, oh, hold on a second, let me get them on the screen. Oh, there's like 3 things I have to check before I go. I mean, it's a real, having some dry runs is going to be helpful. Yeah.
I do have a couple of other things to share, and then we'll just hear from more questions. But one of the kind of my heading for this is like, how can we support our presenters, aka panelists, and participants to enhance their experience? So a couple of notes here. One of the things that I like to do if it is a webinar, in the welcome information that's going out to all of the participants, I like to let them know, like, hey, this session will be a Zoom webinar, which is a little different from Zoom meetings that are more common. One of the main differences is that attendees participate and listen in view only mode. And this means your camera will be off, your microphones are muted, the Zoom chat will be available, if it will be, as a place, to share instructions, ask questions, connect. And there's no waiting room, but we will start a few minutes early so you can get settled in. Again, because that word webinar gets used a lot. And it's just nice to know, like, do I need to be camera ready if I'm joining this webinar, or can I like still be in my PJs and drinking my morning coffee and joining a 6 a.m. East Coast time webinar? So I like to let everyone know, like, what does this really mean in terms of the functionality, just to help them be ready. I have shown up to sessions like fully ready to be camera ready. It's like, oh, we can't even turn our cameras on. Like, I wish I would have known this 15 minutes ago. I could just show up, not knowing about that. So being clear with participants ahead of time about the webinar experience, I think, is really lovely to do. The other thing is, while Zoom meetings, have much more of the collaborative, participatory elements, always available to us, Zoom webinars less so, but they can still be participatory, but just in a nonverbal way. So thinking about, again, like, how can we still invite interaction and participation in nonverbal ways, whether it's through the reactions, integrating polls, or other collaborative tools like Menti, Padlet, Miro, etc. You can still do all of that, with links through the Zoom chat. So really thinking about, how can we still create a participatory experience, inside the webinar tool. And then just thinking about some of those, a few different preparation questions that I have for my webinar, my clients, like, who are all the speakers and panelists or others on the tech and hosting team, so we can set them up as panelists ahead of time. That's not something that we have to worry about with Zoom meetings, but you really have to get way clear about, like, who is everyone, so we can set them all up ahead of time. It just makes it a lot easier, although it's a little bit more work, but it is easier. And then really confirming those webinar settings that need to be turned on or turned off inside the main Zoom account. And some of those even have to be enabled when you schedule the webinar, as well as double checked in the main Zoom settings. So I really go through those much more specifically. I do that with Zoom meetings too, but it's sort of like even extra with webinars. And then doing a mini test webinar before the session with your client. Mostly it's to give them the experience of what's different in the Zoom webinar. And I usually join with as many devices as possible so they can really see that difference between, what are they seeing? If they can join with the second device, they can see what's different from the panelists. So doing that mini test webinar with the main client a little bit ahead of time, so they can experience some of those slight differences. But yeah, I'll pause there. Those are just some of the support tips for presenters and participants to enhance their experience. What's cooking in the chat, Heather?
All right. So we had a couple of things here. You did a great job of answering, Linda, and I gave a visual from Tech Host Academy as when we are tech hosting. And I think this might even lead into Jacobin's question too, is that we are thinking about, how do we put those presenters in that best light? How do we make sure the participants have all the functionality, everything that they need in order to engage or participate in whatever way is appropriate for the design of the meeting? And then, of course, the design or the process. How are we holding that space for all three of those things to happen? And when I think about Jacobin's question about how many tech hosts are needed, well, we know that in meetings, something that Lauren Green talks about is you want a tech host for every 15 to 25 people. Now, that seems a little excessive if you've got hundreds of people, right? And so it depends on, and maybe she's talking about, 50 people or 100 people, what that looks like. And it really, again, depends on the design of that meeting. How interactive do we need to be? Are we going to be using third-party collaboration tools? Are we breaking out into separate meetings? And do we want to make sure that we've got people there along the way? And knowing the tech savviness of our crowd. If I think about if I'm going to do a highly collaborative event, which I did early on in the pandemic, and I was the only tech host, and we had over 170 people in the room, and they were not tech savvy. And I threw them all into breakout rooms, gave them all a Google Doc that we were all sharing on, and they lost their minds because the Google Doc kept changing because of all of these questions they had to populate, right? And I went, you know what? If this were a room of facilitators who had experience working online in shared documents in breakout rooms, they would have gobbled that up and went, done. And we would have been done in 15 minutes. But, weeks later, people were like, what was that? I was going, that was a big experiment. And it helped me realize that tech savviness of the group is such a key piece. And so, do you need to do a tech check session before the session to make sure everyone is working from the same foundation? Do you need to send them out maybe one-page quick guides, or give them a space to practice in, or watch videos to prepare? This all comes down to design. The conference will be held in March 2024, so you have some time to design it. Okay, that's fantastic. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. What's the size of the conference, if you don't mind sharing? Is this okay, Amanda, if we dive right into it? Okay, cool. Because I
You,
didn't know if you had more to share.
Heather, do you want it by chat or just talking?
No, you're welcome to talk. Yeah.
Oh, well, it will be. It was supposed to be a hybrid one, as in November, but we decided that was not a good idea for the experience we have and the budget we have. So we split them up, and now we have the conference online. We will be holding it in March 2024, and I hope we will have about 250 persons online live all over the world. So that was the number the last couple of years, but this will be more professional. Well, we will do it more professionally than the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So we have more design to do.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And again, the complexity of how many breakouts, and again, how tech savvy are these folks, will determine that. I don't know if what I put in the chat, if you saw that about the roles
Yeah,
of the tech host, if that's helpful. That's just a very basic, right? To add to that, now that I'm thinking about what you're saying, to add to that, you've got to have probably some breakout tech hosts that really know what's going on. And if you're going hybrid, when you say hybrid, do you mean that there are going to be some people that are in person in a room somewhere?
no, not anymore. So
Okay.
it's all online now. And
Okay.
but I think it's all agile people, all a bit of a geek when it comes to that. So I'm not worried about the tech savviness. I'm more worried
Yeah.
about my tech savviness. That's more of the thing.
Right. And so, not to say that you're not in your lane, because I'm sure you are. I'm curious, do you have other thought partners? I mean, besides me, besides
Yeah.
Amanda,
Yes.
that you can
Yes.
also work with? Excellent. Good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to start as well. I think that's a key piece. So I'm
Yeah.
glad you said that it's not also hybrid, because that, like Priya Parker says, when you do hybrid, you're really planning 3 meetings. You're
I
planning the
know.
in-person meeting. Yeah. Yeah. The
That's why
participant.
we quit it off. It was not a good idea.
Yeah, yeah. Even if some people are in the same building, having them in their own offices on a computer would make it so much easier than planning those 3 meetings.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, it sounds like you've got some time. If you have more questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. Um,
Thanks. I
yeah,
will.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Amanda. You're sharing a link to the Zoom webinar information.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
sharing
Oh,
it one
great.
more
Okay.
time. Want to
Yeah.
just kind of come back to Linda's question too about ways to support webinar host moderators that's different from supporting the panelists. I think one of the things is just really talking through that this like some of those visual differences between Zoom webinar and Zoom meetings, just to not only to help them like know the difference, but it might change their mind. Not being able to see everyone can be a really big, even if people don't have their cameras on, just even knowing like, oh, you can see the 60 or 80 or 100 little boxes, you know, on the screen. It's like, oh, I know there are people out there versus, you know, only your other panelists or only your tech team, and just seeing that list of people, which, you know, isn't as easy to sort of see. So I think for hosts or moderators, just really helping them know what it's going to look like and be different inside the webinar experience, so they're ready for that. Yeah, like one person, when we talked it through, they were like, oh no. Even if people don't have their cameras on, I want the chance for them to be able to be seen. A conference I did earlier this year in May, we really talked it through. The design was more webinar-like we weren't doing breakout rooms. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for people to speak. It was more webinar-like in terms of the design. But when we talked through the different functionality, they were like, no, we want to do this as a Zoom meeting. We want to be able to see people even if they don't have their cameras on. It was such a big factor for them. So it was like, cool, absolutely, let's do this as a Zoom meeting for sure. So that, yeah, that just might be one little bit. More messages arriving, so fun. Yeah, Karen, my honest answer is I don't know, because I personally haven't tested out the new breakout room functionality with Zoom webinar. So I am so curious how it works. That might be a cool Sandbox Academy thing. We're just like, we're gonna just test Zoom webinar breakout rooms. How does this work?
Right.
I personally, I was
next level.
blown away when I saw that they were releasing that. I was like, what? Breakout rooms for Zoom webinars? Okay, curious.
Yep. And I did test using annotation screen in webinar, and it
Oh,
worked. And that was fun. And again, talking about how public it is, that is one way that someone can get really inappropriate quickly if they have the ability to annotate and type things, right? Or draw things. And so keep in mind that while that might be a consideration, depending on how public it is, you may or may not want to use those functions. But I like to say, and thank you for being honest, Amanda, I too haven't used a breakout room. You would anticipate that it would function just like meetings, but what we've learned where those are two separate products and they're developing them almost not as asynchronous, or more asynchronously, but not as synchronously as we would have hoped. But with all of the new releases, and I don't know if any of you have downloaded the latest version of Zoom this week, but they've announced AI companion. So there's a lot of ways that Zoom meetings is trying to be a lot like Microsoft Teams, in that there's chatting in between classes, there's sharing of the whiteboard. We've already seen some of that, but now they're adding a lot of AI features to that. And so just know that there's so many changes all the time. While we've done a lot of homework with Zoom webinars, and Amanda, you and I have worked together and done this. This is going to be like a blip in the radar when it comes to technological changes in the coming months and year. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It
So
keeps
what
us
else?
on our toes, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
Any more Zoom webinar meetings or Zoom webinar questions before we jump into other questions that we can also sandbox, because we've got about 20 minutes left. Yeah.
Oh, I have something.
Yes.
I had just recently encountered this with a potential client where they didn't even have a Zoom account. So they didn't have a Zoom Pro account, Zoom Meetings account. And they thought that they could just get a Zoom webinar account. And as far as I understand, that's not how it works. You have to have your basic Zoom paid plan, and then you add on to that the webinar plan. So there was just a little bit of oh, wait, no, actually, if you want to host this in your own account, you have to set up your Zoom paid plan first and then do the webinar add-on, as far as I could understand looking through it.
Yeah.
So yeah, one little oh, wow. It is so funny, all these little oh, don't assume, even though someone's asking about running a webinar, that they might not even have a Zoom account that they have for themselves.
And I want to tell you, I will admit it, you all know that I love it when things break and when I make mistakes so I can share them with you. So I purchased a one-time 1-month Zoom webinar, set that up, offered the course. Amanda and I were in there testing it, doing great. I set up a Zoom webinar for just yesterday that I was going to test with Muddy. But because I only purchased it for 1 month, not auto renew, when I went to go dial into that Zoom webinar, even though I had the link, it didn't exist. It wouldn't let me in. And I thought at first I thought, oh, it's going to charge me for another month and let us in, sort of like it does with the cloud recording, but it didn't. And so just be very, very aware that if you are, oh, I'm just going to buy a month now, and then my event's not for a little while, because Zoom webinar add-ons can be kind of expensive. Um, you might want to consider that, and put that cost towards the budget, or pass that cost on to the client, because it does cost money to have Zoom webinar. And even Muddy said right now he wasn't purchasing Zoom webinar. And we all kind of, those of us that are only doing it a few times a year, we just purchase it when we need it. So it's not something you have to purchase a whole year for, but you can if you want. And if you plan on doing something ahead of time, at least do the month-to-month auto renew. Yeah, so I'm curious. We have a couple of people that are outside of the US, and I just put a link in the Zoom or in the chat. Those of you who aren't in the US, I'm curious, when you click that link, does it automatically go to your own country's Zoom webpage? Does it ask you where you're from? What happens? It doesn't ask where you're from. Okay. So it probably goes right to, does it say Zoom CA in Dutch? Okay, cool. I love that. I love that we can share those and then they'll automatically translate for us or take us to the right place. So to answer Linda's question, my experience is yes, the recording is in my Zoom account. It'll go into the recordings as a webinar. I can't remember if it was in recordings or webinar, but I was able to download that, and it acted just like meetings.
Just big thanks for the chance to share some of what I've learned in the translation journey from Zoom meetings to Zoom webinars.
Yeah, and I would love to know, what's your next best step? So how do you plan on using this information? Do you plan on doing a little bit more research? Are you going to go out and try to find a Zoom webinar to host, test? What do you plan to do next with this Zoom webinar information? Great. Research and start your design. Wonderful. Run away. That might be an option. Stay away as far as you can. Many of you know that Mike Muddy Schlegel has a studio that looks like the Star Trek Enterprise, right? And you know me, I like to work with my computer, my integrated cam, my IPvo, and that's about it. I like to make it as simple as possible because I think there are different levels of tech hosting and producing. And so for me, I'm doing the bare minimum and bringing in experts like Amanda to be able to answer a lot of these questions. So great. We've got 2 hybrid events coming up in 2024, so you'll better know how to advise the others on working on them. Yeah, start early, plan often. Yeah, wonderful. I'm glad you're talking to your clients about that. Help them decide. Yeah, and the information guide is packed full. And until you really get in there, it's like, how is this relevant? But at least you have that language. I thought that was one of the biggest surprises for me. Is I read Amanda's I read that guide, and then when we came into practice, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe these are different. And what does this mean? And we literally went through all of the different settings. So what other questions bring you here today? The sandbox session is really built for come and bring your questions. There's no question too big or small, maybe too big, but if, if so, we'll bring in the big guns. But what questions do you have today to help make your meetings, your upcoming meetings, more efficient and help you feel confident in them based on webinars or not? Yeah. So Karen's saying she has a solution to share. Excellent. What have you learned, Karen?
Well, can you hear me? Okay, just checking. I gave my speakers to my co-host at the meeting last night, so I have to wear my. Anyway, Heather, you may remember that last week I wrote to you and said, I have to try and figure out how to get a better sound. And and Amanda, I think you're the one, having listened to you, and I recognize the screen in the background. You had recommended using a Yeti in the middle of the room. But knowing that I had speakers and other things, I drew out a schematic and emailed Muddy, because you reminded me of Muddy. And this is what I'll put the name of it it's called an anchor. what is it called? Anchor Power Conference S3. Power Conference S3. It's a Bluetooth and USB speaker phone. So what he's recommended, and he even gave me made a little video to show me. I can put it out. It can be moved around to various people because it's Bluetooth. If somebody in the group needs to talk to somebody else on the online, because we do hybrid groups, they can do that, but then they can also hear the whole project. And I'm really hoping it works because he said he's recommended it to other people. So,
Do you remember what the price point on that was, Karen?
Right now, because we had it sent by Amazon Prime. I have a friend with an account. It came too late for us to use yesterday. Our meeting was at 7 and it arrived at my house at 6:15. So it was $99, and I asked my friend to add 2 years of warranty kind of stuff. So $107.47 is what we're going to be sending her back with, reimbursing her for.
I am going to put a link in the chat, and I'd love for you to confirm if this is the one that's it, because it's also $99 and it's on sale for 20 some percent off. So it might be something others. Okay, great.
Yep.
Good to know.
We did. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Super. Thank you so much. We'll definitely report back and let us know.
Oh, absolutely. And it's bigger than I thought it was. It's like hand size. The picture shows it, and I'm thinking it's going to be this little pocket size thing. Somebody's going to walk off with it, but not likely.
That's good. It probably needs to reach a lot of air. So that's awesome. Yeah. It says it looks, yeah.
So I solved my problem. Thanks for the tip a reminder to write to Muddy.
Yeah. He's a great resource. Good.
Oh, heavens. Yes. So
thank you for sharing that.
News.
All right. Thank you, Karen. And Linda's asking, what can she do to support tech hosts better in the planning stage and the day of? And my first response is that flow document, the facilitator's guide with an actual column for the tech host for them to put notes in there. You might even prompt them by saying, put this in the chat. Here's a link to the thing that they need. Is that something that you currently use when you deliver, Linda? Are you using facilitation guides, things like that? Yeah. And what would you add, Amanda, to supporting tech hosts? Yeah, on the planning stage and the day of.
Yeah, I think just being really clear on what you need them to do and what you are comfortable doing. Like I work with some folks that I will do all the screen sharing for them. Like they're just like, no, I don't want to screen share. Like, can you do it for me? And so just like asking for what you need. Can you do this? Can you play this music? Or, can you not? I think that's the other thing too, is for tech hosts to know like what your preferences are in terms of the kind of space that you like to create. So just not being afraid to be super clear about what you are needing their help with, what stuff you would rather be in charge of. Yeah, just that role clarity and just helping them really understand the kind of space and vibe that you're wanting to create together.
I love that. Role clarity is so important. And, when something goes wrong, it's easy to point the finger at the tech host. And if something doesn't go wrong at all, nobody notices. Like nobody gets credit for it going great. It's like, oh, you don't even say that was a great meeting because the technology was awesome. No, we only notice it when it breaks. And so the role clarity is really good to know, because if no one's answering in the chat, if no one's moderating, then who to point the finger. But as a tech host, it's important that we find and fill those gaps where we can. Yeah. Yeah. Linda, I'd love to hear your experience as a tech host.
Yeah, I'm rarely a tech host, so I don't often either volunteer my skills, because I know that's not necessarily my lane. But because of just um the spread of Zoom, not only professionally but also just personally in our world. One of one of my friends had a memorial for her husband who passed, and she wanted to do it virtually, but she just didn't know where to start and didn't have like a Zoom account. So I said, okay, I'll see whether I can help you out. So from the tech side, everything worked okay, but then she was sort of hosting the event, but because of the high emotions obviously that surrounded it, she then said to me, well, Linda, what's next? And so it was just sort of this weird thing where because of my facilitator training, I knew to create the document, what's happening, create some space for anything unexpected. So then I kind of went into this mode of hosting kind of this event without even really realizing, because I was so concentrating on the tech part, which I'm not as experienced with. So that was a different experience. And I'm sure, I mean, both of you are strong facilitators as well, but do you have any stories where you thought, okay, this is the lane I'm in, I'm focusing, and all of a sudden, like crickets and something's happened to the host, and you're like, uh-oh, do you have anything to share on that?
We're both on mute, laughing, nodding our heads, going, oh, yeah. That's why my shirt says host is really highlighted here, because we're really hosts more than anything. But people think it's the technology, so we got to do that too. So what would you like to share, Amanda? Anything come to mind?
Oh, I mean, so many things, Linda. I've had everything from our main host, like losing power on Pender Island the day of. And I would say one of the things for me that I always have to with clients that know me really well and know me more as a facilitator and less as a tech host is they'll just expect like, oh, Amanda will do all of the introducing of like the small group questions and the framing and all of that. And when I'm tech hosting, I'm like, no, like I need someone else to do that because I am frantically, still creating customized breakout rooms and making changes. And so I've had to do just some really like loving coaching with my clients to be like, no, I need one of you to do that part. And I will pick up like some of the tech instructions around the collaboration tool, but that's definitely been a learning curve where sometimes they've just been, and over to Amanda to tell us all about this. And I'm like, I am busy.
Right. Right.
How about you,
Yeah.
Heather?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I wrote a playbook on tech hosting based on all the things that have went wrong. And so it's all about these wonderful glitches, right? And then you say, okay, how do I make the next meeting better? How do I make the next meeting better? And just trying one thing. I will tell you a couple of things that I do beforehand to kind of show up, because what I think happens is that people think, oh, well, she's not doing anything. And remember, we are this beautiful swan above the water, and under the water, we're going like this. We're stitching people into breakout rooms. I was tech hosting one time where the client, even though I was part of the design of the meeting, because I wanted to make sure that the tech host had a very valuable role in the presentation. This was with a client that they had, it was very complicated, but they had two people that could not, for legal reasons, be in breakout rooms together because it was an HR issue, and three people who needed to be separated because they were leaders, not because they couldn't be together, but because they needed to be in these different rooms. And there were 20 some people that was in this 6-week long training every Friday. And so I also had to make sure, because these were two teams that were trying to integrate, that they tried to integrate as much as possible. And so when you're doing that, you have to be like this incredible puzzle solver in who can be together. So what I would do is I kept a spreadsheet, and I would say, okay, are we in triads? Are we in pairs? Are we in small groups? And on what day, and who is with who? And I'm taking screenshots to make sure that that's who got in with who. And then I would put that screenshot in the chat so everybody knew where they were going and who they were talking to. It was very complicated. And there were times where at the last minute they would say, okay, so we're going to go into triads. And I was like, crud, I had everybody in pairs. And so then I had to put everybody in triads, make sure that the leaders were, within those different groups, and the two people were not together. And by that time, I had already learned that those two people had allies, right? So there was a lot of politics going on. There were like two different camps because it was an HR issue. And so it was like, oh, I had to really think about who was going in rooms with who. And that was really, really challenging. And so I did a quick debrief with the team and I said, we've been at this for 5 weeks. We only have 1 week left. So there's no, hand slapping here. But when you said from pairs to triads, I want you to know what we went through. And it really opened their eyes because it was a team of 6 people and they had no idea. They knew from the beginning those 2 people couldn't go together, but they didn't realize the work that went into all of that organization. And Linda, I know you and I have been in lots of trainings at the Center for Appreciative Inquiry together. And I don't know if you were in a training where I tech hosted. And so you can understand I tried to get all the students to kind of be together. But you and I were in a training where they just stuck us in random groups. And I think like 3 times we were in the same group in the same training. We're like, okay, well, we're just going to start working together. And we did, didn't we? We did our final presentation together because it's like we got to know each other so well. And so there's some pieces in there that the breakout rooms, I will tell you that for beginning tech hosts and even more advanced tech hosts, that's one of the main questions that I get is, how do I do breakout rooms better? I mean, I can certainly give you a link to where you can find it on Zoom and how to do a breakout, but there's so much finesse that goes into it. And start adding I shouldn't say a new feature because I think it's been around for about 6 months, but did you know that you can have a poll and based on the poll, you can then go into breakout rooms. So how people answer a question can determine what breakout room they go into. And sometimes that's a little bit more engaging or interesting than just saying in the chat and then trying to stitch people together or having them choose their own breakout room. Right. So we know that we've got some settings that once people are in a breakout room, they can't switch or they can hop around. They can leave and go to a different breakout room. So there's a lot of different nuances with breakout rooms that we can use both for functionality and for making it engaging. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing what you said, Linda, about doing a memorial. I know that that's really tough. And when emotions are high, this is where our presence is such a big piece. Now, I put in the chat earlier about holding a space for the presenter, holding a space for the participants, and holding a space for the process. And there's a really basic service, like what do each of these people need in order for this to be efficient and engaging and equitable? But then there's also our own presence. And I mentioned the swan. Now there's the presence, and I will tell you that I have on the weeks that I tech host, because I don't want resting thinking face. Look at how beautiful Amanda was like 2 seconds ago when she was like, I'm composed, right? So I literally get sore in my face from smiling or just holding a face that's not this. So just know that that is also a thing. We've got to be present. We're paying attention. Sometimes I will look at the chat and almost like on purpose because I'm seeing a chat. And that body language is telling the person that just typed and then they're waiting for somebody to answer their chat that, I saw it. Sometimes I'll even go, hold on a second, to let them know a visual cue, I'm seeing this. And maybe I don't have time to type. Oh, that's a really great question. And I'll get to it in just a second. I also have a little notes on the side of one of my windows where I can copy and paste basic responses. These are scripts. These are all little tips to keep that presence up so that people know that you are holding a space for them, you're of service for them, and you're there to help. Yeah, especially when things blow up. Yeah. All right. Well, we are at time. Any other burning questions before we go? This has been a rich session. Yeah, Karen. And if people need to drop off, we totally understand. We'll keep recording.
I was just saying, fantastic.
Good.
Sorry. Jazz hands, whatever you want to call it.
Yay. So big round of applause for Amanda. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being here. This was so good. And you really demystified Zoom webinars in a way that the way you presented it to me was like, oh yeah, we did all of that stuff. You're so organized. So thank you so much for being here. All right, everyone. I would love to see a one-word checkout in the chat. How are you feeling? Are you full? Are you excited? Are you confused? Do you have more questions? Love to hear how you're leaving this session today. So good. Oh, glad to hear that it was wonderful. Happy to see you're excited, satisfied, and energized. All right. Thank you, everyone. So great to see you. And hopefully we'll see you in the future. Happy tech hosting.